Concepts such as freedom, modernity, progress, religion, and tradition are commonly invoked in the discourse of progressive politics. But what assumptions underpin our understanding of these concepts, especially with respect to the relationship between feminism and Islam? Why does a firm dedication to modernity, women's rights, and leftist principles is often accompanied by the requirement to criticize and distance oneself from traditional and religious ways of life? What counts as a coherent feminist politics when the never fully accomplished process of critical interrogation constantly imposes new demands on our political views? These are some of the questions that we'll explore today in our conversation with Dr. Nadia Guessous. Dr. Guessous is an associate professor of feminist and gender studies at Colorado College. Her interests include gender and sexuality, post-colonial and transnational feminism, religion and secularism, progressive politics, modern subjectivity, North Africa, the Middle East, and Islam. In today's episode, she'll be drawing upon her doctoral research to dissect leftist feminist subjectivity in the wake of the Islamic revival in Morocco. Her research is both ethnographic and genealogical, based on a 2-year field study conducted between 2004 to 2006 among the first generation of Moroccan leftist feminists. Her interlocutors were activists who became involved in feminist causes after their initial involvement in and subsequent disillusionment with leftist and Marxist ideologies during the early 1980s. Drawing from ethnographic observations and in-depth life histories, this study delves into the process of how Moroccan feminists were shaped into distinct forms of modern leftist subjects, and why an aversion towards tradition and pious ways of being became central to their politics. Welcome to Haqq, a podcast on Islamic studies where we try to make the Islamic tradition interact with secular forms of knowledge, and where we explore questions of politics, theology, and philosophy through an Islamic lens. So, as you know, today we'll be discussing your dissertation that you wrote at Columbia University, titled Leftist Feminist Subjectivity in the Wake of the Islamic Revival in Morocco. So basically, we'll be focusing on the two conundrums that form the core of your research, and we'll unpack them one by one in this conversation. While doing so, we'll also try to rethink with you certain assumptions about concepts such as tradition, progress, agency, and so on that dominate the leftist feminist discourse. But before we get into that, it would be great if you could tell us a bit about yourself and the experiences that shaped your research interests, especially your interest in feminism and Islam, and what specifically got you interested in anthropology.
Okay, yeah, so thank you again for inviting me to this podcast. I'm really excited to be here. So as far as my intellectual journey, began in the context of post-colonial Morocco in Northern Africa. And I say post-colonial in the sense of in the wake of French and Spanish colonization of Morocco, where Morocco obtained its independence in 1956. The Moroccan context continues to be marked by the aftermath and legacies of colonialism and its multitude of forms. So I grew up in the Muslim majority North African context of Morocco, grew up in a leftist context. My father was a leftist public intellectual, university professor, activist. He was a member of the Socialist Party in Morocco. He was also one of the founding members of the sociology department in Morocco at the Mohammed V University in Rabat. So the environment I grew up in was both intellectual, leftist, but also predominantly a majority Muslim context where my everyday life was punctuated by the call to prayer and sort of a certain Islamic sensorium, and where Islamic practices were part of everyday life. I attended public school, and then eventually went to Mohammed V University, where I did some university work there in literature, and then eventually moved to the US in order to complete my university education. That sort of move to the US was very much enabled by the fact that although I grew up in Morocco in a predominantly Moroccan Muslim environment, my mother was originally from the US. And so it was always understood that at some point, my siblings and I would probably do some college work in the US. And so that was part of that trajectory. But I mentioned that because to pursue college education as a Moroccan citizen and subject in a context such as the US is not one that is most Moroccans, and in my case was very much sort of an effect of the privileges accorded to me by the fact that I had dual American and Moroccan citizenship, right? And I think that that privilege needs to be named because these are not, sort of trajectories that are merely individual. So when I moved to the US, I knew I had an interest in sort of cultural studies, media studies, and that is where I started. I attended a large public university on the East Coast. And my education at that point was very much interdisciplinary. I knew I was interested in questions of power, questions of representation, legacies of Orientalism, of colonialism, and eventually sort of found myself taking a variety of classes, including with the Colombian anthropologist Arturo Escobar, who was teaching at University of Massachusetts Amherst at the time. And he taught an undergraduate course called The Anthropology of Development. He also was teaching a graduate course called The Anthropology of Imperialism. So I was really intrigued by, this idea of turning the anthropological gaze towards something as normalized as the idea of development. And that was the first anthropology course that I took. And then eventually I asked for permission to sit in on his graduate seminar on the anthropology of imperialism. And it is in part because I accidentally stumbled into these classrooms with a very unusual anthropologist that was later, I later found out, right? That I ended up applying to PhD programs in anthropology. And I've actually written a piece about my relationship to anthropology as a field, and I call myself both a reluctant and accidental anthropologist. When I applied to PhD programs in anthropology, I hadn't quite sort of processed and realized how unrepresentative, right, that kind of anthropological approach was. And I was later to find out that people like Arturo Escobar, were still very much sort of in the margins of the field. So my relationship to anthropology, as I describe it, is an accidental one. In other words, I could have ended up in any number of fields, but I found within, the Columbia University Department of Anthropology a certain willingness to rethink what it formed as an anthropologist, to ask anthropological questions. And most of my interlocutors and peers and professors there were very much interested in using the anthropological project in order to render visible, right, modern, secular, colonial, imperial, neoliberal, etc., forms of power, rather than simply turning the anthropological gaze towards those racialized, colonized subjects of the global South, and then translating their difference and making it more palatable for the West. So, that's just a little bit in terms of my relationship to anthropology. And based in an interdisciplinary feminist and gender studies program, and happily so, because this is a space that allows me not only to focus on feminist thought and questions of gender and sexuality, which have always been central to my interests, but also to inhabit an interdisciplinary space that is not preoccupied with the disciplinary gatekeeping or simply with the reproduction of the normativity of certain forms of knowledge. So in my sort of current professional life, while I remain an anthropologist by training, I'm sort of at some remove from the discipline and am very much sort of happier and intellectually more comfortable inhabiting a space of interdisciplinarity. So, and I just want to sort of comment a little bit about the question of feminism in Islam, right, which was also part of your question. What is the intellectual journey that contributed to my interest in questions of feminism and Islam? And I think that as I reflect back on my trajectory, I think that part of my interest in feminism and Islam originally was a manifestation of the ways in which those of us with some proximity to Islam and those of us from the global South are invited and called upon, right, to narrate our questions and narrate our interests in ways that are legible to the West. And so I do think that probably when I originally, sort of proposed a project that had to do with gender, and that I don't think that it simply stemmed from an unmediated interest. I do think that there was a part of me that was responding to a certain incitement to discourse about the question of gender and sexuality in Islam, right? Eventually, with the help of teachers and scholars and interlocutors like Lila Abu Lughud, Sabah Mahmoud, and Layla Ahmed, and many others, I came to think more critically about the ways in which those of us who come from predominantly Muslim contexts are only sort of invited to the table in certain very limited terms. And certainly as a Muslim, Arab, Moroccan woman, one of those terms is to invoke the question of gender and sexuality. So luckily now in my work and my teaching and my writing, I am very much thinking critically about that demand of very limited legibility. But I do, when I reflect back, I do suspect that part of my interest was in sort of unintended effect of this incitement to discourse about questions of gender and sexuality in Islam.
So please give us a brief background to the emergence of leftist feminist politics in Morocco, and how did it engage with Islam?
Sure. So those are really, sort of two big questions. And I will start with the first one. So what I refer to as the leftist feminist tradition in Morocco, I think has until sort of the past couple decades simply been referred to in the past as the women's movement, right? So there was a time when sort of scholarship and dominant narratives about feminism in places like Morocco never bothered to make any kinds of distinctions, right? It was almost as if there was this element of surprise that those of us, from the global South or in a sort of predominantly Muslim context such as Morocco would have a feminist movement to begin with, right? That it was almost sort of a mode of discovery, going from the assumption that feminism is something that originates in the West or in the global North, right? To then all of a sudden discovering that some of us outside of the borders of the West also have feminist critiques and ideals and aspirations. But in that gesture of recognition, right, of Western recognition, that gesture of Western recognition was deeply homogenizing in the sense that all that was recognized was the existence of a quote unquote women's movement or feminist movement, right, with no consideration of the possibility that there might, in fact, not only be certain feminist movements and critiques in a place like Morocco, but in fact that there might be multiple versions of it. Is that correct? So already for me to not ever refer to feminism in general in Morocco, to never say the feminist movements in Morocco or feminists in Morocco, right? And leaving that feminism unmarked and unspecified, right? So already there is a certain critical gesture, a certain insistence that the global South and places like Morocco are also complex and characterized by multiplicity, and that, I'm starting to tell the sort of story and history of feminist movements in places like Morocco with an eye towards that multiplicity, and to not, tell our own stories on homogenizing and essentializing Western terms. So, so my project is not about feminism in general, right? It does not presume the existence of a singular feminist movement in a context like Morocco. Instead, my focus, the focus of my work is on sort of founding members of the feminist movement in Morocco who happen to come from a leftist tradition. Yeah. And I think that specificity is important, especially in light of the Islamic revival that then in many ways, right, renders even more visible, right, sort of the specificity of that particular version of feminist politics. Yeah. So that's something I will talk about shortly, but the feminists that I worked with are commonly referred to in Morocco as Bnat al Yassar, right? Girls of the left or women of the left, right? Bnat al Yassar, and that's in Arabic and specifically in Darija, the spoken form of Moroccan Arabic. So Bnat al Yassar is a way of acknowledging and recognizing that the feminist politics of the particular generation of activists with whom I worked are activists whose politicization first emerged within various leftist movements. Some of them officially recognized, some of them underground movements that were censored and banned by the state during what were known what was known in the context of Morocco as the years of lead, meaning the years of political repression, from the sort of independence, really, you could say, up until the late 1990s, is one way in which the years of lead have been understood, although one could say, that we are still living within various manifestations of the years of lead. So these were my interlocutors, were, young high school, college students, right, who became involved and interpolated by various, student, worker, leftist, Marxist, Leninist movements, right? And so through questions of gender and sexuality, but rather through questions of anti-imperialism, social inequality, justice, dignity, the workers' rights, et cetera, right? And so many of them became politically active at a very young age 13, 14, 15, 16, right? During their high school years, they were greatly affected by various moments of great political violence and protests that took place. They saw many of their friends and siblings and teachers and cousins etc., neighbors get arrested or disappeared or beaten up by the police, or right. And so it was very much a form of politicization that was critical of state power, of the corruption of the elites, of the abandonment, right, of the most marginalized. But it was also sort of transnational movements in solidarity with the Vietnamese, anti-Vietnam War, right, in solidarity with Palestinians, et cetera, right? However, and so, and this is a sort of political history that was really formative of the kind of activism, but also of the kind of feminism that they eventually embraced. And the feminist critique part, and this I think is extremely important, the feminist critique starts to emerge for many of these activists out of their immersion and involvement in various leftist progressive movements, right? So it was out of their involvement within various leftist progressive movements that they came to develop a feminist politics and a feminist critique of the ways in which of their marginalization within the movement, of the ways in which sort of sexism manifested itself within progressive politics, the ways in which men's labor was seen as, and political contributions were seen as, superior to the political contributions and insights of women, where women in many ways, women activists were seen as, sort of the political party, et cetera, right? And therefore, Bnat al Yassar, right? Daughters of the left. So they were in many ways sort of embraced as part of a leftist family, et cetera, but were not always accorded the kind of respect and care, right, that one might perhaps expect, right, from a family member. And they started really struggling with some of the hypocrisies and double standards. And furthermore, right, to be constituted as a leftist subject does not simply mean to be a leftist activist and to believe a set of ideas, et cetera. It's also to become part of a certain affective world and world of social world, et cetera. And so many leftist activists were also sort of friends, if not lovers, right? And had intimate relationships with each other. Many ended up marrying each other or sort of entering into, sort of long-term relationships, starting families together, et cetera. And also out of that sort of personal experience, right, or more intimate experience with various leftist men came to develop a deep disenchantment with the gender politics of the left. Out of that disenchantment with the gender politics of the left, the ways in which it spoke of equality and social justice, but did not, right, sort of critically interrogate certain forms of patriarchal power or certain sexist practices, right, that were very much the norm within leftist circles, they came to experience a deep sense of disenchantment. So that disenchantment is what then gave birth to their desire to start a feminist movement, right, in which their preoccupations that continue to span, right, and to include larger questions of social justice, et cetera, right, They, wanted to be able to create a political space in which their concerns and preoccupations, including but not limited to questions of social inequality, redistribution, etc., would take seriously the sort of the kinds of feminist critiques and attentions to the gender and etc. So then they started various organizations in the 1980s, in the middle of the 1980s, and that was the birth of the sort of independent, self-described feminist movement. And I continue to describe it as a leftist feminist movement because in its initial stages, it was primarily leftist activists, right, who were occupying these spaces, and they and the activists who came from the left never stopped thinking of themselves as Yassariyat, right, as coming from the left and belonging to the left. And so that departure from other leftist structures like political parties, etc., did not mean that they severed their ties with the left, right? And so, I think that's what I would like to say about the leftist feminist part. So, and just like in other parts of the global South, the feminist movement in Morocco also coincided with the NGOization of politics, right? So then the way to imagine a feminist project is to create an organization, right? Sort of a nonprofit organization. And then, so the birth of the leftist feminist movement in the mid 1980s, indeed, it took the form of the birth of multiple organizations that were primarily led by leftist activists, especially in the initial stages. As far as the question of the relationship between these leftist feminist movements and the question of Islam, I think that there is no sort of singular answer to that question, and that one has to think in historically specific ways. One has to also be careful to not homogenize the leftist feminist movement. Is that right? Relationship and way of conceptualizing religion as something that can operate as an obstacle. Is that correct? An obstacle to emancipation. There are certain leftist propensities to think about religion as something that keeps the most marginalized, right? And that while there might be a certain acceptance of the fact that to many Muslims, they cannot imagine sort of, a just life, right, that is not embedded in Islamic principles and ideals, I think that a certain leftist political imagination is not always able to conceptualize a better future, right, that continues to be fully embedded within religious traditions, et cetera, right? And so this is what I come to describe in my own work as a certain form of secular normativity, right? Where at some level, whether it is explicitly described or not, there is a sense that a better future is one in which religion is going to certainly have a lesser place. Is that correct? And that the Islamic tradition is certainly not necessary to that emancipation. Yeah, so I'll put it, I will stop there.
The first conundrum of your research. So you described that many of the feminists whom you interviewed spoke very approvingly of their fathers, whom they described as traditional, religious, and also egalitarian. And many of them told you that it was their fathers who enabled their feminist politics in many ways. They were the inspiration behind it. But at the same time, these interlocutors of yours criticized progressive leftist men for, being quote unquote traditional and for not having been able to embrace modernity in its proper sense. And they did this because their progressive husbands and the leftist men whom they saw around themselves were very dismissive of women's concerns. They were insensitive towards them. So the insensitivity and the unsupportiveness of leftist men was thereby blamed on tradition. So there are two conflicting understandings of tradition involved here. And this is what the conundrum is. I mean, I have broadly described this, and I would like you to elaborate more upon it by perhaps giving us a few examples of such interactions that you had. But my broader question to you is that when tradition is blamed for the insensitivity of progressive men, then what does that tell us about the way leftist feminists whom you spoke with perceive modernity and tradition?
So, so my project, sort of when I originally wrote it, was organized around two conundrums. And indeed, this is the first conundrum, which first was sort of based on a element of surprise, right? When I went to Morocco to do research among leftist feminists and eventually sort of built enough of a relationship and enough trust with a number of differently positioned leftist feminist activists, and asked if I could record their life history narratives, right? Where I say, tell me about your family background and how did you become a leftist feminist, etc. I started noticing that there was a recurring pattern that I had sort of not expected at all, namely that most of my leftist feminist interlocutors would say something along the lines of, I grew up in a traditional, pious, egalitarian family context, and I became a leftist and a feminist because I was inspired by the egalitarianism of that family context, and specifically by the egalitarianism of my traditional pious father. Now, when one imagines leftist radical feminist politics, these are not the kinds of narratives of gratitude, of indebtedness towards the past, towards traditional masculinity, towards traditional families and homes that one expects. Is that correct? We have become, I think, accustomed to associating progressive, leftist, radical, feminist politics with a certain ambivalent relationship towards this thing called tradition or towards the past. And so I became increasingly fascinated by this moment that kept repeating itself, right? And it took me a while to really make sense of it, right? That almost every leftist feminist whose life history I recorded at some point, right, included sort of this kind of narrative, right? And in those moments, the sort of dominant affect was one of, as I said, inspiration, gratitude, indebtedness, a sense of being really grounded. Many of them would say, I did not have to struggle to become a feminist, right? My family was, even though they're Pauline, right? They supported me in sort of what they understood as my quest for greater justice, et cetera, et cetera. So in those parts of their life history narratives, tradition and traditionalism, including traditional masculinity, was never posited as a problem. It was not posited as symptomatic of something in need of overcoming, right? But then when these same interlocutors would start talking about their disenchantment with the left, is that correct? With their disenchantment with the politics, the gender politics of the left, and specifically also with their sort of maybe sort of more intimate, right, and personal relationships with men of the left, then I noticed that their use of the word traditional would be very differently inflected. So all of a sudden, I would hear them say things like, well, so-and-so claimed to be modern, but really in the end, he just was traditional. And that was the problem, right? The problem with the left is that it claims to be modern and progressive, but really it is just mirrored in traditionalism. And so therefore leftist men, are not living up to the modern ideals of equality, et cetera, that they have promised. And so in that moment, I was always struck by the ways in which their use of the term tradition and traditionalism seemed at some great distance, is that right, from that original invocation. And so this is the first conundrum in my work is, how is it that an embodied, lived, visceral, a lived experience, an embodied and visceral and affective experience with a traditional context, right, with traditional modes of sociability, of organizing families, of notions of justice, right? The name of your podcast is Haqq, right? So notions of justice, right? How they're lived and embodied experiences of what one describes as a traditional context, right? Were so formative to the feminist politics. I think, number one, that is really important, right? And also to their leftist politics. But then somehow were made irrelevant, is that correct? In their critiques of what they saw as the double standards and hypocrisies of leftist, progressive, for the most part, secular men, right? And so it's not so much that I think that there is something problematic about leftist feminist understanding of tradition, I think, especially given my location, right? Then as a diasporic Moroccan feminist scholar living in the heart of the US empire, I think it would be really problematic for me to just say, so therefore my leftist feminist interlocutors are getting tradition wrong. I mean, for one, tradition is a concept that is discursively produced. Is that correct? It's not like there is something that we can just say and determine once and for all is traditional or is not traditional, right? Sort of what is seen as traditional is always produced in discourse in relationship to something else, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's not so much that I think that they are getting tradition wrong. It's more that I think that this sort of, this paradox, right, is reflective of the ways in which leftist and feminist and more generally sort of progressivist subjects from these parts of the world, from places like Morocco, are called upon, is that right? Are called upon to narrate and think about their feminist politics in ways that conform to the teleologies of the West. And the idea that somehow, or the teleologies of the sort of post-Enlightenment world, where there are certain notions of progress and of emancipation that require a certain relationship to the past. And so while my interlocutors' lived experience might in fact complicate that assumption, right? There is a certain difficulty that they experience in giving themselves permission, right? To then sort of have that lived and embodied experience reflected in their feminist critiques that then they feel the need to articulate based on the teleologies of colonial modernity. And I don't know if that's too obtuse an answer, but again, I want to make it clear that I don't think that there is a correct or wrong way of getting tradition, but I am very much intrigued by the ways in which the leftist feminists I work with are sort of feel compelled, right, to critique leftist progressive men through the disavowal of tradition, when in fact tradition and traditional ways of being were the very inspiration of their politics. And this is what I describe. The tragedy of progress is that it requires a disavowal of the very conditions that gave rise to the possibility of a critique and a desire for emancipation.
Right. So let's move to the second conundrum now,
Sure.
hijab. So could you describe some interactions that you had with your interlocutors about the hijab? And were there any contradictions between their larger ideals and their attitude towards veiled women?
Yeah, so if the first conundrum has to do with the ways in which leftist feminists in Morocco narrate the emergence of their feminist and leftist politics as intimately tied with certain life worlds, right? That many would characterize as traditional, etc. But then in their critiques of the left and of sort of the gender politics of the left, go on, right, to sort of disavow this thing called traditionalism and tradition. And that's the first conundrum. The second conundrum has to do with the fact that the leftist feminist movement, as it developed over the years and decades, right, came to articulate inclusivity and autonomy as really foundational to their movement, right? So if leftist feminists originally came from leftist movements, political parties, et cetera, right, and came to develop a certain disenchantment with that way of organizing politics, and specifically came to struggle with the fact that there was what they saw as a certain sectarianism, right, to leftist political movements where you're either inside the left or you're outside the left. Is that correct? And they came to find that that kind of political sectarianism was not going to be compatible with an inclusive feminist movement that would be open to all, regardless of political ideology or belonging. So then out of that, they came to insist on the importance of being an autonomous feminist movement that would be representative of the needs and concerns of all women. Now, of course, we can step back and wonder whether it is in fact possible to realize that ideal, right, of being able to represent the needs of all women, right? That's a sort of a rather grandiose aim and an ideal, but like all ideals, right, are characterized by a difficulty of realization. Otherwise, they would not be an ideal, right? And so taking the leftist feminist movement seriously on its own terms and accepting, so they aspire as a movement to not just represent leftist progressive women, right, like them, right, but rather all women. Is that correct? I noticed, sort of through my field work that there were certain tensions, right, that had to do with this commitment to being an inclusive feminist movement. There was a certain tension between this commitment and an actual ability to open up their organizations and spaces, right, to a younger generation of Moroccan women and Moroccan activists who had been formed within the Islamic revival. So the Islamic revival, as many scholars have, there is now a sort of very broad scholarship on the Islamic revival. So as many of these scholars have suggested and described, the Islamic revival is a grassroots, right, movement that emerged across different parts of the Muslim world, including amongst Muslim minorities, let's say in Europe, right, or other parts of the world, a grassroots movement that emerges, let's say, starting roughly in the sort of 70s, right? It starts to acquire 1970s, more visibility and publicness in the 80s and 90s. That stems from a certain disenchantment with the secularization of modern life, right? With the ways in which the domain of piety and of religiosity has increasingly in modern life been sort of relegated to certain domains, right? And where Muslim ways of being and ethics and principles are not allowed in many ways to sort of operate as sort of primary right? Sort of principles in the organization of everyday life, right? Where sort of a characteristic of modernity and of modern states, right, is to be thinking about the economy on the one hand, the law on the other hand, and then religion, right? And so this sort of mode of differentiation, right, of creating distinctions between different domains of life is one that has led to a certain transnational grassroots critique of what many see as sort of the marginalization of religiosity in everyday life, or in the domain of, sociability or sartorial practices or the sensorium, or, right, so how people dress, what people listen to, what they read, what they watch, how they interact with each other, right? The Islamic revival has entailed a certain desire, right, to bring back sort of a greater centrality and significance of religiosity into everyday life, right? And sort of thinking about religiosity as something that is not reducible to, let's say, fasting during the month of Ramadan, praying, sort of a certain number of times per day, right? And going to mosque on Fridays, right? But rather, how can one think about a way of being Muslim that doesn't leave Islam at the door when one goes to the workplace or one goes to school? Right. So that would be one way of understanding the Islamic revival. Yeah. So not as something top down, not as something that it has sort of a headquarters or is attached to a political party or whatever, but rather as a sort of grassroots movement to recenter the place of the religious in everyday life. And in Morocco, the Islamic revival, like in other parts of the world, sort of led to an increasing visibility of markers of religiosity in public life. And so what many of my leftist feminist interlocutors started experiencing is sort of a sense of panic, yeah? A sense of panic, sort of as the feminist movement started becoming more established, more institutionalized, sort of on solid footings, et cetera. It started to notice that sort of the very generation, let's say, that had the most access to education, had the most access to the public sphere, had the most access to the workplace, was interestingly also renewing and insisting on its right to renew its ties to the Islamic tradition. And so many of them, sort of felt really disoriented, right? So one example that I give in my work is, one of my interlocutors saying, we have not worked and struggled all these years so that young girls go and put on a hijab, right? So sort of the hijab, which is a sartorial practice, it became sort of pregnant with meaning, to quote a chapter called The Discourse of the Veil. So there's something about the ways in which the hijab became saturated with meaning and a site of great anxiety for leftist feminists, the ones that I worked with, in ways that then oftentimes led to exclusionary practices, yeah? So the second conundrum has to do with this desire to be an inclusive feminist movement that is open to all, accompanied with a certain disorientation at the ways in which the promise of modernity leading to greater secularization, right, has not materialized. Yeah. And so the questions that I ask of my interlocutors is, how can one make sense of the limits of this inclusivity, right? How can one make sense of the limits of this inclusivity that sort of draws the line at the hijab, right? So in all my time doing research in Morocco, I spent 2 years living in Morocco, exclusively doing research, and I went back for multiple trips after that. And all my years, right, I never encountered a single muhajjaba who was a member of these feminist organizations. At most, maybe a muhajjaba, meaning a woman who wears a hijab, might be employed as a secretary or in one instance as an archivist, etc. But those who came to do sort of represent feminist organizations were, for the most part, those who were not wearing a headscarf. And this wall, sort of headscarf wearing, became, sort of very prevalent, especially in large urban centers in Morocco. So why is it, I ask, does the leftist feminist commitment to inclusivity stop, right, at the hijab? And what does this tell us about the sort of limits of a secular conception of inclusivity and sort of the ways in which secular normativity operates at a visceral level, right? By creating certain anxieties and fears that I think can come in the way of what I describe as sort of a cross-subjective engagement, right? Between feminists who have a critique of sexism, gender inequality, et cetera, from a non-secular perspective.
Okay, so now let me summarize the two conundrums here for our audience. The first conundrum is that many of the feminists whom you interviewed praised their fathers and called them traditional and also egalitarian. But at the same time, they were critical of the unsupportiveness of their leftist husbands, and they blamed tradition for that. They said that their husbands claimed to be modern, but were in fact traditional. So in spite of having had lived experiences, in spite of having had families and pious religious fathers who were supportive, who were traditional but also egalitarian, and in spite of them acknowledging this fact in their interviews with you, your interlocutors felt compelled to then go ahead and blame tradition for the unsupportiveness and insensitivity of their progressive husbands and of progressive men in general, right? So there are two understandings of tradition that are coming into conflict with each other. And, this is what modernity does. It instills in us the notion that in order to progress, we have to leave the past behind. It does not it does not give us a framework in which we can think of emancipation in a way that does not compel us to divorce ourselves from tradition. It does not allow us to think that traditionalism and egalitarianism can in fact coexist. So even though your interlocutors had positive experiences with tradition, with traditionalism, with pious religious fathers, they could not find a room for a positive conceptualization of tradition within their feminist politics. So this is the first conundrum that characterizes your research. The second conundrum is that in spite of claiming to be working for women's rights, in spite of claiming to be inclusive, a large number of leftist feminist organizations in Morocco ended up excluding a very vast section of highly educated women who choose to wear the hijab or the niqab. On the one hand, they claim to be inclusive, and on the other hand, they are excluding a large number of women who could have benefited from their organizations. So this is the second conundrum. Now, my question to you is that how are these two conundrums related to each other, and what do they tell us about modern subjectivity, about modern notions of progress and agency?
Yeah. And so, this is the difficult part, right? Is sort of then, so what, right? How do I then, make sense of these sort of dynamics and tendencies that I am seeing through my work, and why do they matter? And I think what both of these examples suggest is, for one, feminist politics do not operate in a vacuum, right? Feminist politics are also have to grapple, right, sort of with histories, with legacies of colonialism, legacies of Orientalism, right, that have for centuries, right, ever since the 18th, 19th century, right? Orientalist discourse has insisted that the so-called barbarism of Islam is most manifest in the ways that Muslim women and Muslim men treat Muslim women, right? So there has always been this sort of exceptionalizing discourse that locates the locus of Muslim backwardness in its treatment of women. Is that right? And also saturates, right, visibly Islamic practices like the various forms of veiling, right, that have historically existed in different parts of the Muslim world, has saturated those practices, of repressiveness, oppression, etc., so that veiling becomes sort of the ultimate symbol of Muslim women's repression. And so part of my work is to suggest that a feminist movement and a post-colonial, predominantly Muslim context like Morocco, especially in the wake of the War on Terror, right, which has sort of continued the practice of vilifying Islam, homogenizing Islam, associating Islam with threat and danger. Feminist projects and politics in places like Morocco are emerging within these complicated contexts, right? And are not able to simply exist on their own terms, right? They are, feminist movements in Morocco are under pressure, right, to make themselves sort of legible, in the terms that are available to them. Is that correct? And also colonial legacies and legacies of Orientalism are also constitutive of subjectivity, and they're constitutive of feminist subjectivity. And so what I guess I want to show is that the sort of these legacies can manifest in these kinds of conundrums, right? Where even lived experiences are not enough. Is that correct? Lived experiences, lived and embodied experiences are not enough, right, to somehow overcome or resist the insistence that the only way that a Muslim feminist can seek her own liberation is by disavowing the past, right? And even a sort of feminist desire to be an inclusive movement, right? That I don't doubt the sincerity of that desire for inclusivity. Even a desire to be inclusive becomes sort of complicated and rendered almost difficult, if not impossible, because of the constant incitement to discourse about the problem of the veil and the problem of Islam and the exceptional, sort of patriarchy and sexism of the Muslim world. So in many ways, what I'm offering is a post-colonial, decolonial, transnational feminist critique that is in solidarity with these difficulties. I am not somehow claiming that I'm on the outside of all of these power dynamics and I have figured out a way to be truly inclusive or to get tradition right, right? I am instead wanting to render sort of the tragedy of these conundrums visible and to locate them within these legacies and to call for a way of decolonizing feminist politics that would require a lot of work on the self and retelling the stories and the histories of our feminist politics, etc.
Now, would you like to tell us a bit about your next project? What are you working on and what we can hope to learn from you?
Currently a book project. So the project is still in the process of becoming, right? So I've published a few shorter pieces that are based on this research, but I'm working on a larger book version of this project. And some of the other questions that I'm thinking about are in many ways sort of stemming from this from this work, and I'm finding myself increasingly interested in the question of decolonizing memory, and how to think about memory as a sort of as having a certain decolonial potentiality, right? And so you can see that the whole sort of intervention about the question of tradition, right? So how could it be that remembering the past in non-teleological terms can open up a different imagination of the future? So I'm increasingly interested in the question of memory as a site of liberation and of decoloniality. And more generally, I'm sort of interested in sort of decolonial thought and the coloniality of knowledge and thinking about questions of epistemology. Because I think it's not enough to simply tell counter narratives. Is that correct? There's a certain limit to how much counter narratives can achieve. I think that the challenge is about decolonizing our epistemologies and ways of knowing. And so this is these are the new directions in which my work is going these days.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So thank you so much, Prof. Guessous, for answering all the questions very patiently. And I mean, what I loved about your dissertation was your attempt to what you call, quote unquote, denaturalize modern ways of being, to show that, modern notions of progress and agency and tradition and so on need to be scrutinized and explained and should not be taken as a universal self-evident truths. So this was a perspective that I found really refreshing, and it helped me settle a lot of questions and confusions that I used to have. And I hope the same goes for our listeners as well. Thank you so much for being here today. And this was a very enriching conversation. I hope our listeners would benefit from it as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great.